Mhm. Okay, so today we're gonna talk about housing. We already touched upon this topic a lot of times, and it's also connected to the fact that it's my main field of interest as a researcher. Like I work on how, like I work in a field which could be called housing studies. In Ukraine, it's now in a process of development. There are a few people who actually are interested in the field of housing issues, but at the same time, it's a burning issue, and it becomes more and more actual every year as the big cities are growing, meaning that more and more people from other cities come to places like Lviv, Kiev, etc., and where they do not own housing, uh, where they have to rent. So, and this issue of rent is one of the most burning in this area of studies. So we're going to talk both about home ownership, about rent, and the main, I would say, like the main question, the main research question is in this whole field is the affordability of housing. So we look at housing not the way the architects, sorry for mentioning architects so many times, but we're talking about housing not from the point of view uh, of the physical way it exists, but from the social perspective, meaning that we talk about affordability of housing to different groups, which includes range of various issues like exclusion, like gated communities, like segregation, and many other um, scary words you're gonna hear in this topic. So today we are gonna talk about two topics concerning housing. The first one is more broad topic of right to housing. What is this right? Where did it? Where does it come from? How is it legally written down? And the second aspect, we're going to talk about contemporary processes in the development of housing as financialization. We already talked a bit about when we were talking about Circus of Capital, the theory of David Harvey. And today we're going to extend on this issue of how financial institutions are connected to real estate. And I'm going to start with this quote. Please read it. I will read just some of the sentences. Everyone has the right to housing. The state creates conditions that enable every citizen to build, purchase property, or to rent housing. Since citizens in need of social protection are provided with housing by the state. Blah, 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 blah. Where do you think this quote comes from? What is this book? What could it be? I mean, originally it's written in Ukrainian. If you, yeah, please write because I will not hear you. Um, yeah. Ah, sorry. You don't. Yeah. Mm, yes. Maybe you Googled it, but it's a Constitution of Ukraine. Sometimes when I show this quote, I mean, I often start my presentations, my public lectures with this quote. And when I show it to not really prepared audience, Some of them say, oh, it's some communist propaganda um, uh, communique that housing is everyone has the right to housing. This quote actually, in the conditions we live in, sounds quite radical, but it's the basic human right which is written down in many legal documents. In Ukrainian cases, the constitution, but also, as you might know, Ukrainian constitution was very much based on the UN um, human rights documents. So in a lot of countries which consider them to be democratic, housing is, at least formally, is considered to be a right, uh, a, a human right. But then what do we see in context we live in? These screenshots are, I think, 2 years ago. Now the numbers might be quite different. And it's a screenshot from Olix, or yeah, I think Olix. Um, and if we take a look, I did not look for prices in the city center. So where I have chosen Sikhiv. And here we can see the prices for a month's rent in a sleeping district, like in a residential area, not city center. And we can uh, take a look at the average salary. So this screenshot was taken in 2018, and these are the average salaries in Lviv Oblast in 2018. If we take a look at um, maybe some areas of like finance and state administration, probably a person who works in finance or in a state administration could rent this apartment. But if we're talking about, for example, education and healthcare, which is, even more striking, because as we now saw that healthcare is such an important sphere in society, and a lot of other spheres which people are employed in, they might not be able to pay this prices for the rent. I mean, it's striking how the average salary might be even lower than the monthly rent. And to, uh, yeah, not to jump further, there is this very quantitative indicator by which the affordability of housing is measured. Is basically what I just presented. So affordability of housing could be measured through these two numbers I have just shown you. Affordability is the monthly rent divided by the monthly income. Monthly income. The closer is the rent to the monthly income, the less affordable is housing. It's a very simple formula. Also, there is another indicator through which affordability could be measured, is the share of your monthly budget which you spend for the rent. And it's considered that if you spend for the rent more than 50% for rent, you, in many countries, you might be considered as a poor person. So you get the logic. If your income is as high that you pay, for example, 10% for the rent, meaning that you have a lot of money to spend for other things like leisure, like traveling, whatever you want to do. But if half or more, because in many places it's even more, um, you do not, like, you spend 50% or more for housing, which means you do not have access to other facility, like for other ways to spend your money. There are way more ways to measure this affordability, but what is important that it's not some objective sort of number. It's not. It's always the connection between your income and the rent. Of course. In this case, we're not talking about homeowners, because homeowners, they do not pay rent, and this is another important aspect when we are talking about inequalities in post-Soviet countries, that only looking at income, we cannot really understand if the person is middle class or working class or like a rich person, because it's a complex of the way you use your money, where rent or the money you spend for housing, because it might be also mortgage payments. Mortgage payments. You understand what is a mortgage payment? Can you translate what is it in Ukrainian, please? No. Комуналка is utility bills. Mortgage is виплати по кредиту. So a lot of people buy the apartments through mortgage, купують в кредит, and then for the next 10, 20 years of their life, every month they have to pay the mortgage. So, okay, they bought the apartment, but still they are giving back the money to the bank. And this mortgage payment also could be like in this indicators, the monthly rent could be replaced by monthly mortgage payment. Depends on what we're talking about. So that's just the logic we look at the affordability of housing through, and also on the social inequalities, because as I mentioned before, okay, we might talk about lower income, but then if people have housing, all this like 100% of this income goes for spendings they need to do apart from housing. But it's very simple idea that it's not, it doesn't matter how much you earn, it matters how much you spend. And of course, if housing becomes like a huge share of your monthly income, then it doesn't matter how much you earn. Maybe the most like a good example of this dependency is the Silicon Valley, like where all the offices are of Google, whatever, Facebook. So these areas, like it's a network of cities, the Silicon Valley, where like the best IT people in the world work. But at some point, what happened is that a lot of these super talented IT professionals who have quite high income, they were living in their cars, or they were living in trailers, the American home on the which is attached to the car, because okay, they're very well paid, but the prices of housing are going up so much that it doesn't matter if you're paid like super well, you still cannot afford housing. This is the story of many big cities, that okay, people move to a megapolis because the work opportunities, they are really good. But when the companies are able to pay high salaries, then the landlords are sitting there and waiting to raise the rent. And as the as the constitution, as we read in the constitution, if some people cannot afford to build, purchase, or rent housing, the state is supposed to provide some sort of help. But if we take a look at the data on the state mortgages to young families, maybe you've heard about this program. So in Ukraine, we do not have like a proper social housing system, but there is this system when you either wait for the housing which is provided by the state, or you are taking the mortgage for a very low percent from the state, or the state pays part of your cost for the mortgage or for purchase of housing, and then you get the apartment sort of from the state. If we take a look how the number, so that's the this column is the number of this пільгові кредити, subsidized mortgages, which were given in the whole country of Ukraine. And these numbers are just funny. Like the issue of unaffordability of housing could not be really solved by providing even 1,000 of apartments for the whole country. Like, we're not talking about one city, we're talking about the whole Ukraine, and every year the state helps like 200, 300 families to buy the apartment. But it's nothing if we take a look at the broader situation. And there is a question, why is it like this? Okay, in Ukraine, we have quite a specific story. We see how state is not functioning. We have quite a small rent market, which gives opportunity to landlords to maybe speculate on the prices and so on. But it's not only a Ukrainian trend. And there is a good book which was written about this issue by Peter Marcuse, whom I mentioned already, and David Maiden. They're both still alive. You can see them in the picture. This is Peter, this is David, and this is David Harvey sitting next to them. So they're all friends. So this book is called Right to Housing. And what is their explanation of this trend towards unaffordability of housing is that very similar to what Lefebvre told us, that provision of adequate housing is seen as a technical problem or technocratic, which could be solved through some technocratic means. Better technology, more construction, smarter planning, better management. But in their opinion, the crisis is way deeper, and it is hidden not in the amount of housing we built, but it's hidden in the way the housing is distributed. And in this book, they show us this conflict between housing as a home, so as domivka, and as a real estate. What do they mean by this conflict is that on one hand, there is the right to housing, for example, which is written down in Ukrainian constitution, but in many other documents. And it's a sort of right we are supposed to have as humans. Of course, it's also socially constructed. We can step back to the to the period of French Revolution and talk about what are human rights in general. But there is this ideology that everyone is supposed to have a home, and being homeless is bad, and blah blah blah. So, and housing could be seen as home, as the place we spend our free time, where we form families, where we relax, where our life is happening. At the same time, the same housing is a real estate, which is supposed to bring profit. And they say that it's a constant conflict between these two understandings of what is housing and what role it plays in the society. And of course, they are criticizing that housing becomes more real estate than home. And they say that the reason for basically this unaffordability of housing is not that we do not have enough of it, that there is like bad technologies, or builders or don't know how to build. Okay, these issues might also exist, but they focus our attention on how housing is being redistributed. And actually, this contradiction between production and distribution was studied way before they wrote um, this book. It's quite recent. It was written 4 years ago. This contradiction between production and the distribution was very well studied on the example of socialist countries, where in certain periods production was just skyrocketing. So we're talking about Khrushchev period in Soviet Union. Similar processes were happening, for example, in Hungary, which is described by Ivan Zeleny, whom I'm quoting here, that in many socialist countries, the production of housing was just super fast. A lot of Khrushchevkas were built like every month, but then it still did not solve the issue of affordability. People were still waiting in the lines. And this example of experience of this socialist housing agenda shows us that it's not that much matter of how much housing you build. It's the matter of how you distribute it. And here comes two sides of distribution. First of all, we're talking about social, of course, distribution, because as you might know that in Soviet Union, more privileged, especially people who are closer to the party, were getting housing. So it's a matter of like social inequalities. In contemporary world, it's not matter of being closer to the party, it's matter of your economic status. But at the same time, distribution has this spatial aspect, because if we're talking about Soviet experience, there was a very like top-down way of planning the cities, like urban planning, and the party, often in Moscow, was deciding that like, okay, in Kiev we build that much housing, in Ternopil we built that much housing, but then it was like spatially built, not where people really needed. And that's another aspect of distribution. I hope you got this idea. So to sum up this idea of right to housing, that on one hand there is a contradiction between if housing is a home and everyone has the right to have it, at the same time housing is also a real estate from which some actors are profiting. But then when we're talking about that we want to somehow balance this contradiction, there are also two answers to this question, how to balance this contradiction. And one answer is that, okay, we just need to build more. There is unaffordability of housing. People in Lviv cannot rent, cannot buy, because we do not have enough housing. So we built more. But that's also a trick, because even if you build more, but this housing is not distributed spatially and socially, then you might get into a constant cycle of building new housing. People cannot afford it because it's not affordable, like economically affordable or affordable in the place where they need it. You build more housing, you build more housing. In the end, it might come to the crisis which Harvey talked about, that we fix the capital in the real estate, but then people are not able to afford this real estate. And yeah, we have a crisis in different spheres. On one hand, it's a housing crisis. On the other hand, it's investment and, like, in general, financial crisis. Is this clear? This idea of housing as a home and as a real estate, and then the issue of distribution. Okay, I hope it's more or less, yeah. By the way, this so the book is in English, and you have the whole book on the CMS, but there is also a translation which I made a student to make a couple of years ago. So the introduction to this book is in Ukrainian. You can easily access it. Yeah, and Marcuse and Maiden say that this question of right to housing was, in Western tradition for them, of course, was first raised by Engels in his essay. It's more of a book, Housing Question, where he, as you might know, shows the experience of Manchester, which is being rapidly industrialized, and new factories are being built. Workers come to the city, but then they have to live in basically slums. And what Engels has in his writings, and the idea they take to their book, is that housing crisis might be perceived as it was, by the way, like the financial crisis of 2008 was often described as housing crisis, because, as you might know, the whole global financial crisis started from the fact that many Americans could not afford to pay back their mortgages, housing mortgages. And it sort of started in this housing sphere and went as a chain to the whole global economy. But what Madden and Marcuse highlight to us, that we have heard about those housing crises, but for working class and other poor communities, housing crisis is a norm. So they show us that if we, and for them in contemporary world, housing is a real estate, first of all. Like the fact that it's a home is not that important in contemporary economy. And what they say, that for many communities, the unaffordability of housing is not a certain period of time, it's the norm they live in, like everyday issue. That, and it very much like is bounded to the fact that housing is being a private property, and that the working class always has to rent, that like buying is something far away for them, is something super unaffordable. And if you always need to rent, it means that, okay, today you spend 20% of your income on the housing, on the rent, but maybe tomorrow you will need to spend 50, and so on. But as we also mentioned, I think during the seminar with the second group, that on one hand, what they also highlight, that Access to housing is a constant struggle for many people to pay their rent, to find a place which suit them more. But at the same time, this space of your home could be a place to which you attach your cultural identity, your individuality, and form the community, which, as we mentioned in a previous seminar, might be very important to doing something about the urban development which goes against the interest of your community and so on. So there is like two-side effect of housing. On one hand, you have to struggle to have it, but at the same time, while you're struggling with other people, you can form a community which becomes a basis of your identities, of your lifestyle, and potentially of a struggle to collectively do something about the housing issues. But this is like a very general framework, and it's a more like a philosophical text which I'm offering you to read, which in general discusses housing as part of people's life, economic, but also uh, this like very something very private where you together, I mean, on your own or with your family or with the closest people you have. But housing is not always like, it's very rarely discussed in this very abstract terms, because usually housing is studied more like through this macroeconomic perspective. And it's something I'm offering you in the next part of the lecture. Don't be scared of the graphs. Just try to get like the main idea, like to grasp the main idea. But yeah, housing studies are about uh, usually quantitative research, indicators, and some other uh, boring stuff. And yeah, and the second article I wanted to discuss with you is the article of Manuel Albers, who is a great colleague of mine. Worked with him while writing my dissertation. He works at the University of Leuven, by the way, Catholic University of Leuven. And he developed this idea, I mean, he developed this theory of financialization of housing, which he derives from uh, Harvey's conception of circus of capital. If you still remember what Harvey was talking about, so as you remember that Harvey develops this scheme to understand how the economy works, like historically. So he says that after the Second World War, global economy was in the stage of productive economy. So we're talking about the mass production of basically every goods. Then, as for Harvey, of course, sorry, I need to bit. Yep. Do you still see me well? Maybe I will turn on another light. Sorry, because my lamp is bothering me a lot. Okay, hope you see me. At least I know you hear me because it's recording. So Harvey tells us that economy tends to work through series of crises. The first crisis which might happen is the crisis of the productive economy. So you have a factory, you exploit your workers in this factory, and at some point, because of this exploitation, your workers, who are at the same time are your consumers, they cannot buy what you produce, And there is a crisis of either underconsumption or overproduction, which are the same thing, basically. And you have two choices. You can either redistribute what you're producing, or you can try to save the accumulated capital you have. Um, Common scenario is try to invest in the real estate to save your accumulated capital. And then you parked your money, you're doing well, but you still need someone to rent what you built, or at least or to buy it. But if you do not want to lower the prices, at some point the demand, the effective demand, will go down. Like people will spend all the money they have and will not be able to buy your housing or rent it out. What could be the strategy for the developer to drive this demand, to create this demand? Forget about Harvey, just like think about the economy the way you know it. There is a developer. He built a high rise. People bought this high rise, like bought the apartments in the high rise. Then he took his profit and invested in another high rise. And then there is no demand, like no real demand, no effective demand to buy it because it's too expensive basically for people. Of course, he can lower the prices, but then he will lose his profits, or she. What could be done to stimulate this demand? Like, try to think about it not in a theoretical way, just like how people buy apartments. Yes, but then if you rent it, your profits are coming to you slower. It's one of the strategies now in I don't know about Lviv, but in Kiev we have a lot of housing complexes which are built for rent. Like they're not sold, they're rented out. But I mean, what? Mm, yeah, you can always destroy old houses. Yes, credit. Yes, exactly. This is the main point, that when like Harvey, and then it's Albers, so this guy we mentioned, he says like, Harvey, you're not, because according to Harvey, the developer who, or in general, like we're not talking about separate developer. Harvey sees this process is that like capital is being invested in real estate, and then there is a crisis, and for Harvey, state intervenes and says like, okay, the economy is shutting down, so we need to redistribute the money, and the money is being redistributed through the state. But Albert says like, no, it's not the way it actually went. And he talks about 2000s, basically. He talks about last 40 years when all over, and it's a global trend actually. What is interesting, we're not talking about Western Europe or elsewhere, so it's a global trend that at some point real estate companies, they were not able to profit because their prices were too high, so demand could not meet the supply. So banks stepped in, and different kinds of financial institutions, sometimes also state financial institutions, and they introduced mechanisms of mortgage. So mortgage is credit. I mean, in Ukrainian, Ми говоримо взяти квартиру в кредит, і у нас є це слово кредит. In English, it's interesting because word credit sort of means the same, but it's a verb. It's more like you credit. The bank credits people, but the mechanism is mortgage. Іпотека. Тобто, yeah, like mortgage is іпотека. Also, mortgage might be an adjective, like you say mortgage credit, тобто іпотечний кредит. But this whole, all these words like credit, mortgage credit, also the word loan, займ, it's all the same thing. It's when in this whole circle of urban development and housing development, banks step in and they provide the mortgage. And if demand, and with the mortgage, demand grows. What also grows when the demand grows? Mm-hmm. Competition. Okay, so there are more people who can buy housing. More developers want to. Yes, more like I'm now gonna very in detail. You're all right, but I'm gonna like very in detail explain this process because it's like super important to understand. But it's really simple. You just need to understand it once, and then everything will be clear about this financialization thing. So the state or the bank gave the loan. Demand grew. So, for example, before I could not buy an apartment, I took the loan, now I can buy it. Of course, many developers, so now we're talking about the supply side, many developers like they know that people are getting loans and they're like, okay, I'm ready to provide more housing. So supply grows, the price grows, of course, because the developers, like when there is no demand, no effective demand, like real effective means the demand people can pay for. Because I had a demand for housing, doesn't matter if I have money or I don't. If, for example, I'm a migrant in Lviv, I would like to buy an apartment. So I have this demand. But before I did not have money, then I got the mortgage and I can immediately buy the housing. But a lot of developers realize it, that they can get their profits not in the long term when I will rent from them and pay them like every month. They know that I can like immediately pay them the whole housing price. And of course, they build more and they raise the price. What happens when prices go up with the demand? Yes, demand goes down, so people need more mortgages to reach the level of the prices. They take more mortgages, prices go up. People take more mortgages, prices go up. And in the end, some of these stories are successful, but it's a very risky mechanism because if there is no regulation of this whole rise of the prices and this game of supply and demand, what we have is the global prices of 2008. Or in our case, what we have is one of the like physical consequences of this crisis, which also, of course, touch Ukraine, are the abandoned housing developments. So that people started spending their money, but then it's the other side, because uh, mortgage could be taken not only by the consumers, it also could be taken by the developer himself. And if the developer cannot pay back his mortgage, then he stops development, and people lose what they invested in the apartments they wanted to get. So this whole process, which I just explained to you, is called financialization of housing. The idea is that housing development is being driven by financial actors. It might, and as I said, usually we're talking about banks, but it might be any other financial institution which provides this loan. And why is it like this? Why the explanation is actually very simple. Why is it like this? Because mortgage and any credit, it's sort of a money from the future. It's not. I mean, it's supposed to be the money you get when you have the debit and credit. So, like for example, I keep my money in the. You probably know this mechanism, but okay, one more time. We still have time, so I will explain this. Theoretically, how banks function. They collect money from people who have money. Like I keep my salary in the bank. Then they put this money in some productive economy. They circulate this money, they get some profit, and they give you your money back, and they have this profit. And they give this profit as a credit to some other people who do not have money. But imagine if we're talking about credits, but that's the way it should be. But banks sort of separate this two processes in time. They give you credit for the debit which is supposed to be produced in 10 years. But it's not but it's not produced because these investments are going to real estate, which is cannot bring you much profits. Maybe now it sounds a bit complicated, but just think about mortgage as money from the future. And sometimes, okay, you're able to invest this money, get a profit, and return the credit. But if you're not, what happens then? Then the creditor takes your property. And that's this story, what is interesting. This story, I just told it to you on the example of the 2008 crisis, where housing played an important role. But basically, the same mechanism is used when Ukrainian government takes credits from IMF. It's the same logic. Ukrainian state takes a loan. It's supposed to invest it, get the profit, and return, but it's not happening. In Ukraine credits its economy since quite a long time, and we're still in huge debt. Which, every time we take another loan to cover the debt, and then another loan, and then another loan. But then how it's going to end, no one knows. Every new president tells us that, okay, I will take a loan and everything is going to be fine. But it's a circle, which is it's a process which goes in circle. But yeah, let's come back to the housing, and we still have a bit of time for me to explain you how is this whole thing connected to Ukraine. And now I'm gonna basically retell you my dissertation, and you will see how boring my life is actually. That's what I spent 4 years, no, 3 years of my life on. So I try to explain how, in my dissertation, I try to explain how private market of housing emerged in Ukraine. Because on one hand, I mean, for us, it's people who live like in Eastern Europe, sometimes we're like, oh, Ukraine is the most horrible, corrupt country ever, blah, 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 blah. Maybe, I don't know. But then for a researcher, it's an amazing country because if you want to, like in Ukraine, a lot of processes which are dated in many countries for like hundreds of years, in Ukraine, these processes took just like several decades. And housing market, like emergence of housing market is one of the examples. Like housing was not redistributed through market mechanisms in Ukraine ever. And then in 90s, this process starts. And it's interesting to look at it because you can easily talk to people who were creating this market. You can, I mean, I collected interviews from people who became first landlords in Kiev, for example. And it's very interesting how they were, it's all was very new to them. They had, for example, they privatized an apartment from the Soviet housing stock, and they lost their job and they realized that they can actually get some money through renting out, but they never rented out. For them, their whole life, rent was something criminal. As you might know, like rent, housing rent in Soviet Union was prohibited. I mean, it still existed in some shady forms, but yeah. And then it's very interesting how certain individuals create a rent market, which did not exist before. Because, and you cannot study these processes elsewhere. You can study them only in post-Soviet cities. Because this like creation of rent market in many places, it happened hundreds of years ago, and you cannot actually talk to those people. Okay, you can read archives, but it's boring. Here you can, sorry historians, but it is boring to read the archives. But here we can actually talk to people who were first like entrepreneurs, first real estate entrepreneurs. And yeah, so I asked myself a question: how could I describe this process of creating a housing market in Ukraine? I focused on Kiev because it's the biggest city, also because it's my native city. And first, I just decided to take a look on how city was growing. And it's very interesting because, so you can see this graph here. I will make it larger. So it's amount of housing which was built in Kiev since 1995. And it's interesting that if you take a look at this blue graph, Kiev was not, I mean, it still grew by 20%, which is a lot, like it's a lot. But then it's not as rapid as it seems because, okay, city in 20 years, it grew 20%. Sounds fine. But then if we take a look at Kiev suburbs, that's where the most interesting part is. Because if we just take a look at the city itself in its official borders, it's not growing. It is growing, but not that fast. But if we, for example, take a look at places like Brovary, Vishneva, and many other suburbs of Kiev, it just skyrocketed. And that's, I mean, this data is easily supported by just going to the, sorry, just a second. Okay, talking for 3 hours in a row is not. I also had meeting before, like in the early morning. not the best idea to talk for 4 hours in a row. Yeah, sorry. So this data I'm showing you of this rapid growth in Kiev could be easily supported by just going out in the streets and looking uh, on how the city is being developed. But it's interesting because this data is just about Kiev. It's interesting to do the same for smaller cities in Ukraine and to try to understand this uneven development we discussed later. Because, okay, we know big cities are growing, but where do people come from? What's happening, I don't know, in Ternopil or some smaller cities in Ukraine, Kherson, Mykolaiv? I assume, I do not have the data, but I assume these graphs might even go, the other way. But then the question is, okay, city was growing, housing, here we see just housing, but how did it happen? And the second indicator I take a look is the housing prices for this housing which was built. And don't get scared, but basically, if we take a look at the housing prices since 2001, I do not have data for 2001, but I have data for 2003. If we take a look and compare them to housing prices in 2008, they grew almost 8 times. And I'm being serious, like 8 times. Тобто квадратний метр коштував $100, він став коштувати $800. So, yeah, like we see the growth is, the physical growth itself does not show us this economic side of it. Okay, physical growth of the city was quite constant, but then the economic growth and the financial part had a completely different history. So in 90s, the story was that the developers were still mostly state developers, which continued the Soviet plans, and that's how Tryeshina in Kiev was built. Also, some parts of Sikhiv, I believe, were developed in 90s. But at that time, housing was not a commodity. Like, it was not something you sell and buy and rent. So housing market did not really exist. It started being developed in the beginning of 2000s. But at that time, still the prices were on the level of effective demand, which was quite low. And then in 90s, what happens is that housing prices go 8 times. And for us, it's difficult to imagine this now because we are now, like, since 2008, what could be broadly, the situation we live now could be described as a stagnation with some ups and downs. But this housing boom and this boom of prices was like super crazy. And it's not difficult to understand why this graph goes down between 2007 and 2008, because in 7 and 9, because what we had in 2008 is a global financial crisis, which strongly affected Ukrainian economy as well. And to understand these fluctuations, you need to understand the mechanism, because for economists, like for a neoclassical economist, this is just supply and demand. But like, why does demand goes down, in 2000? So why does it go up in 2000s and why does it go down? I honestly, very sincerely believe that just economic explanation of it is not enough. You need to look at the social mechanisms of this whole process. And what is the social mechanism in this in this case and in many other cases. So what I did, I just describe case of Kiev. But what was happening in 2000s is that a lot of mortgages were given. And here we have a graph from 2006. Unfortunately, I did not get an earlier data, but the data I got is that in 2006, 7, and 8, the amount of mortgages which were given to people basically grew like 9 times. So we're talking about very, very strong pumping of mortgage money in the real estate, prices which caused super rapid growth of the prices. Of course, it brought some affordability, but at the same time, people needed to repay this mortgage at some point. A lot of people still did not repay the mortgages they took in this period. Ukraine is one of the biggest, like, Ukraine has one of the highest numbers of non-performing loans. NPL is another indicator of the housing market, which is like percent of the loans which are not being repaid. But apart from, so this boom and then crisis, okay, it caused a lot of housing issues for people who took the mortgages. Yeah, and of course, as you might remember, that a lot of these mortgages, they were given in dollars. And one of the reasons why this whole crisis affected Ukraine even worse, because people took the mortgage in dollars and they hryvnia went went down. So it used to be 5, then it was 8, now it's 25 or something, but you still have to repay your mortgage in dollars. And of course, these caused a lot of like social issues and a lot of issues with affordability of housing. But it also caused like a huge gap in the state budget, because banks, Ukrainian banks, they took credits from the outside. They gave this money for people as mortgages, as credits for cars and a lot of other things. And then people were not able to return them. So Ukrainian banks got a big hole in them. Of course, this issue was solved, and that's like one of the most for me, like most cynical things about how the state works and how like private institutions work, because in the times of crisis, the first actors who were saved were banks. And basically, very well known to you, Privatbank got a huge investment from the state budget to save itself, and it was saved, as you know, because a lot of banks were like closed, a lot of smaller banks. But this logic of like saving, of this like too big to fail, that if you're fail, and Privatbank was like failing completely, Ashad Bank was failing completely. But they were saved, not the people who actually could not return their mortgage. That's why they were losing their housing. No, the banks were saved in the first place. But the interesting thing is not even this. The interesting part of this story is where Ukrainian government took this money to save the banks. How do you think? It's time of Lukashenko, sorry, Tymoshenko being the prime minister. By the way, so it's her policies I'm describing, of like saving the banks. Yeah, she loaned, but where? from whom did she? I mean, not only she, but there were like a lot of people involved. The thing is that Russia at that time was also in a huge crisis. Yeah, but MWF. So since that time, since 2009, Ukraine becomes one of the biggest IMF creditors. First, it was so the first loan IMF gave to us was invested in closing this like crisis of the banks, which of course a closer because it was also it was very interesting. So when IMF was giving the loan, so the credit, they had a very structured instructions of which banks to save, but none of these instructions were followed. Banks which are closer to the government were saved. Actually, at that time, the so-called Donetsk clan, so Donetsk industrial financial group, they actually got into the trouble because they were not so close to the public figures. But it's another story. I want you to see this like economic logic of constant credits which are connected to housing issues. I mean, not only like I'm not like let me be clear. So Ukrainian government took the IMF loan not because of mortgage system in the housing. Housing was just a small part of it, part of this story of fueling the economy with credit money. And it still goes on. Like it still intensifies. We got IMF credits. We're not giving them back. So looks quite horrible, to be honest. But it still functions somehow. Yeah. So the consequences of this finance-led housing growth, on one hand, it's unaffordability. Because, okay, those people who took loans, some of them were able to give them back. They have their housing. I'm super happy for them. But the prices grew. And prices also grew on the rent market. So prices grew for those who were just there trying to rent. And they grew 8 times. Like, can you imagine what kind of processes we're talking about? Like for example, you moved to Kiev, you got a decent job, you want to, but you cannot, like, you have a good job, but it's not, you're still not a middle class person who can take the mortgage. Or maybe you have a good job, but you just don't want to buy an apartment because you want to move abroad at some point, and you just do not take the mortgage, and you're renting your place for like $100, and then it like doubles and triples in just like in several years. This is like quite a crazy change in your life. Another consequence of this finance-led housing growth is the non-performing loans I mentioned to you. So people who took their dollar mortgages in 2000s, they're still repaying the debts in dollars, which became like 6 times more difficult to do. Moreover, the mortgage system, it's because of this high level of non-performing loans, the mortgage system is in a dead end. Like now we do not have effective mortgage system which could stimulate the housing growth. It's just not functioning. We will talk about it maybe more in seminars, how Ukrainian housing market functions without a proper mortgage system. At the same time, we have a political consequences of political power centralization. Because when you take money from someone, what you often give back is not the money, is your political loyalty. And of course, we are talking about Privatbank, which has this very, I mean, which had this, used to have before it was nationalized, this very strange role in Ukrainian economy. At the same time, it's the political vertical with IMF, which is not even like a state institution, it's an international institution which legally is just a fund. It does not have any like political, there is no law which gives political power to IMF. Moreover, it's international, but of course, it has a lot of international, informal political power, and can give advices on how to reform Ukrainian economy and so on. And like talking about urban level of this whole process is that while this finance was fueling the real estate sector, the urban development went crazy because the developers knew that at some point, and it's interesting how, I mean, this whole story I'm telling you is not just about some like quantitative data I collected. It's based on more than 60 interviews I took with developers, with bankers, chinovniki, and other actors of this whole process. And it was interesting how developers were very open about that. They knew that it's going to come to crisis. They were like, of course, you cannot give people mortgages in dollars and expect them to repay it in like 10 years. It's absurd. And they knew about it, but so they realized that they need to build like super fast, that they need just to build wherever they can. And that's what we see now in Kiev. Of course, in Lviv and in other cities, this was not so crazy. But it also shows this regional gap, because everyone knew that in Kiev you can get the highest profits. It's the biggest city. It's where the investments are. So other cities were lacking this development. And this regional inequality also emerged through this finance-led housing growth, which was super fast and in one place. And we're still dealing with this history. But yeah, I mean, maybe at some point, states will learn how to learn from this processes of this crises, because basically, okay, in Ukraine, nothing really changed since that time. Our president says that he wants to start the mortgage market one more time. He admits that it's in a dead end. And he says that, oh, we will take money from China and start the mortgage mechanism one more time, which is, shot in, not even in your leg, in your head, but it's also a political tool, because if you provide people mortgages, if you provide them services and goods through mortgage, you can say, oh, you see, economy is developing. You're like, you can afford more now. But no one says that you're going to pay, you will need to pay for it like in 5 years, in 10 years. So that's a risk that our new government will, it's now my subjective political thoughts, but I think it's a huge risk that our new government will find some extra money in China or elsewhere, invested in Ukrainian banks. Banks will give mortgages. People will feel that, oh, economy, is working. That's what happened in 2000s. Everyone was like, oh my God, capitalism is great. Market is amazing because it's working, because I have a job. I have a mortgage, I can buy a car, I can buy an apartment, but then it's all shut it down. The same sort of story might happen if Zelensky succeeds in getting some investment from, I mean, he talked about China, but it depends. And of course, it brings votes. So it has a direct political consequences that people get the mortgages, they feel that economy is working, is growing, and they vote for the same president who was at this time of economic growth. But in the end of the day, it's not economic growth, because economic growth is creation of new spheres of economy, is technological development, but not investing of borrowed money in real estate. Okay, I will stop my speech here. Uh, please, yeah, we started a bit later. We still have like 5-7 minutes. I don't know. I hope you understood at least something. Maybe you will need to listen to this lecture one more time. You can read all of this in my dissertation, but please, it's gonna, I mean, I'm not asking you to read the piece of shit. I'm not, okay. I need to turn, oops, I started swearing. I have to stop the recording.